There are maps that no one dares to follow. Routes carved not into paper, but into the collective fear of those who once held absolute power. In the plantations scattered across Georgia's red clay hills, wealthy men who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of lives began losing something they thought they could never lose: control itself. One name, whispered first in slave quarters and later behind the closed doors of plantation offices, became synonymous with an impossible skill: the ability to vanish into the landscape and take others with him. They called him the Ghost of the Swamps. But his real name was Marcus, and the routes he knew weren't marked on any surveyor's map. They were written in the language of survival, traced through cypress knees and Spanish moss, hidden in the patterns of bird migrations and the taste of groundwater. By 1851, 17 plantations had reported losses they couldn't explain. Not destroyed crops or sick livestock, missing people. And every single disappearance pointed back to one man who seemed to understand Georgia's wilderness better than the men who claimed to own it. The story begins not with Marcus's first escape, but with his education. An education that took place entirely outside of schoolhouses and books, written instead into the land itself. Marcus was born in 1819 on a small tobacco plantation near Augusta, the child of a woman named Ruth, who'd been brought to Georgia from Virginia 3 years earlier. His earliest memories were of his mother's hands, calloused, scarred, but gentle when they traced patterns in the dirt outside their cabin. She was teaching him something, though he was too young to understand what. Years later, he'd realized she was showing him how water moved across land, how certain plants indicated underground springs, how to read the terrain for survival. When Marcus was 7, Ruth was sold to a cotton plantation near Milledgeville. The sale was sudden, brutal in its efficiency. One morning she was there, the next she was gone, and Marcus went with her because children under 10 typically stayed with their mothers. The journey took 3 days by wagon, and Marcus spent every moment staring at the landscape rolling past, the way the red clay gave way to sandy soil, how the pine forests changed to hardwood groves where creeks appeared and disappeared. He was memorizing, though he didn't have words for it yet. The new plantation was called Hartwell Estate, and it was massive. Over 3,000 acres worked by more than 200 enslaved people. Marcus and his mother were assigned to field work, which meant 14-hour days during planting and harvest seasons. But it also meant exposure to the land. Marcus learned which fields flooded in heavy rains and which stayed dry. He learned where the property lines were, though no one had explained them to him. He simply noticed where the work stopped and the wilderness began. He learned that the overseer, a man named Dinkins who carried a whip braided from cowhide, never ventured into certain areas of the estate's western boundary where the ground got marshy and uncertain. When Marcus was 11, his mother taught him the most important lesson of his life. They were working together in a distant field, close enough to the tree line that they could speak without being overheard. Ruth had been quiet all morning, which usually meant she was thinking hard about something. Finally, she said, "You notice things, boy. More than most. That's good. But you can't let them see it." "See what, Mama?" "That you're smart. That you're watching. White folks need to believe we're simple, that we can't think past the next meal or the next day. You understand me? You keep what's in your head locked down tight. You never show them what you know." Marcus nodded, though he only partially understood. He'd understand completely 6 months later when Ruth tried to escape. She'd been planning it for years, he realized afterward. The timing was careful. Early March, when the nights were still cold enough to discourage casual patrols but warm enough to survive outdoors. She'd saved scraps of food for weeks, hidden in a hollow tree near their cabin. She'd stolen a knife from the plantation's kitchen and waterproofed it with pine tar. And she'd picked a moonless night when cloud cover would make visibility nearly impossible. Marcus woke to his mother's hand over his mouth. She was dressed in dark clothes, a small pack slung across her back. "I love you," she whispered. "Be smart. Remember what I taught you." Then she was gone, slipping out the cabin door like smoke. He never saw her again. The dogs found her trail at dawn. Dinkins assembled a hunting party that included local slave catchers and their specially trained bloodhounds. They tracked Ruth for 11 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, across rivers, through swamps, over rocky ground that should have broken the scent. She'd made it farther than anyone in the plantation's history. But eventually the dogs cornered her in a creek bed, exhausted and starving, her feet bloody from walking. They brought her back in chains. Marcus was in the field when the party returned, and he watched from a distance as they dragged his mother past, her head down, her body shaking with exhaustion. The punishment was public and severe, 50 lashes, while the entire enslaved population was forced to watch. Marcus stood in that crowd, 11 years old, and made himself look at every moment of what they did to her. He made himself remember every detail, not because he wanted to, but because his mother had told him to be smart. And being smart meant understanding exactly what you were up against. Ruth survived the beating, but never fully recovered. The infection that set into the wounds on her back spread through her blood, and 3 weeks later she died in the cabin while Marcus held her hand. Her final words to him were, "You remember the routes I showed you. You remember how to read the land." After his mother's death, Marcus was sold. At 11, he was old enough to be valuable as a field worker, but young enough to be easily controlled. Or so the thinking went. He was purchased by a rice plantation on the Georgia coast, near Darien, where the landscape was completely different from anything he'd known before. Instead of red clay hills and pine forests, this was a world of tidal marshes, barrier islands, and coastal rivers that changed character twice a day with the tides. The rice plantation was brutal, even by the standards of slavery. Rice cultivation required standing in water for hours, exposed to mosquitoes, water moccasins, and alligators. Disease was rampant: malaria, dysentery, infections from the constant moisture. Most enslaved people on rice plantations died within 15 years. Marcus arrived expecting to die there. Instead, he learned the coast. The old man who taught him was named Josiah, a former sailor who'd been enslaved after a shipwreck left him stranded on the Georgia coast 40 years earlier. Josiah had spent decades working the rice fields and had survived by becoming invaluable. He knew the tides better than any white overseer, could predict storms hours before they arrived, and understood the maze of coastal waterways that confused even experienced pilots. He took an interest in Marcus, perhaps seeing something of himself in the observant boy who asked constant questions. "Tide's everything here," Josiah explained one evening after work. They were sitting on the bank of a tidal creek, watching the water flow inland as the Atlantic pushed its way into Georgia's river systems. Most folks think tide's simple, in and out, high and low. But it's more complicated than that. Moon affects it, wind affects it, the shape of the land affects it. You learn to read tide, you can move through this country invisible. Travel at high tide, you can take waterways that don't exist at low tide. Travel at low tide, you can walk across mud flats that are underwater the rest of the day. Marcus absorbed everything. He learned that the coastal rivers, the Altamaha, the Satilla, the St. Mary's, were connected by a network of smaller creeks and channels that white settlers barely understood. He learned which barrier islands had fresh water springs and which were dry. He learned how to read the color of coastal water to determine depth and how to spot sandbars before you ran aground on them. When Marcus was 14, Josiah helped 3 enslaved workers escape using the tidal waterways. Marcus wasn't directly involved, but he watched and learned. Josiah timed the escape for a spring tide, the highest tides of the month, which occur during a full or new moon, and sent the 3 people out in a small fishing boat at high tide just before dawn. They disappeared into the maze of channels heading north, and by the time the alarm was raised and search parties organized, the tide had changed completely. The waterways they'd used were now too shallow to navigate, and their path was untraceable. The plantation owner suspected Josiah but couldn't prove anything. 2 weeks later, Josiah died in the rice fields, officially from fever, though Marcus always suspected the overseer had poisoned his food. The old sailor's last act was to pull Marcus aside the night before his death and pass on every scrap of knowledge he possessed. "The coast talks," Josiah said, his voice raspy with approaching death. "You just gotta learn its language. Smell tells you when storm's coming. The marsh smells different when pressure drops. Birds tell you where land is. Follow the pelicans at dusk. They always go back to roost on high ground. And the water tells you everything else. You learn to listen. You can move through this country like a ghost." Marcus spent 3 more years on the rice plantation, learning everything he could about the coastal environment while working himself to exhaustion in the fields. By 17, he'd memorized over 100 miles of coastline, knew every channel and creek, could predict tides with uncanny accuracy. He'd also grown into a physically powerful young man, 6 feet tall, heavily muscled from years of agricultural labor, with a reputation for being quiet, competent, and utterly reliable. That reliability made him valuable, and valuable enslaved people got sold to where they could command the highest prices. In 1836, when Marcus was 17, he was sold to a slave trader who specialized in moving prime workers to the expanding cotton plantations in central Georgia. The journey inland, back toward the region where Marcus had been born, took 2 weeks and covered nearly 200 miles. Marcus spent every moment of that journey memorizing the route. The trader, a man named Phelps who transported enslaved people in coffles, groups chained together at the neck, followed main roads most of the way but occasionally took shortcuts through wilderness areas. Marcus noted every shortcut, every river crossing, every small settlement where they stopped for water or supplies. He was building a mental map, connecting his knowledge of the coast to his childhood memories of the interior. The pieces were starting to fit together. Phelps sold Marcus at an auction in Macon to a plantation owner named Kendrick, who needed workers for a newly cleared cotton operation near the Ocmulgee River. Marcus spent 2 years there, learning the rhythms of cotton cultivation and the geography of central Georgia. The plantation bordered a vast cypress swamp that stretched for miles, creating a natural barrier that Kendrick considered impassable. "Suicide swamp," the overseer called it. "Step in there without knowing the way. You'll be dead in 2 days." Marcus looked at the swamp and saw possibility. On Sundays, when field work ceased and the enslaved population was allowed a few hours to tend their own gardens or rest, Marcus started exploring the swamp's edges. He'd tell the others he was checking rabbit traps or collecting useful plants, both of which he actually did, creating a plausible cover for his real purpose, which was mapping. The swamp was daunting. Water the color of dark tea, stained by tannins from decaying vegetation. Cypress trees rising out of the water, their bases swollen and their knees, woody projections from the roots, jutting up like the fingers of drowned giants. Spanish moss, hanging in gray curtains that concealed distances and directions. And everywhere the sounds of hidden life, the splash of alligators, the buzz of insects, the calls of birds that Marcus couldn't always identify. But Marcus had learned to read landscapes. He noticed that certain cypress trees had marks on their bark from floodwaters, indicating how high the water rose during different seasons. He noticed that some areas had slightly different vegetation, suggesting higher ground or different soil drainage. He noticed where animals moved, deer tracks, raccoon trails, and followed those paths because animals always knew the safest routes. Over months, Marcus began to understand the swamp's internal logic. It wasn't random chaos, but a complex system with patterns and rules. There were solid paths if you knew where to look, hidden beneath shallow water or concealed by vegetation. There were channels that stayed consistently deep, navigable by someone with a small boat or raft. There were areas that were genuinely dangerous. Deep holes, quicksand pockets, territories claimed by aggressive alligators. But those were avoidable if you paid attention to warning signs. Marcus created a mental map of the swamp, dividing it into sections based on navigability and hazards. He identified 3 different routes through it that led to solid ground on the far side. each with different advantages depending on season and water levels. He tested these routes himself, sometimes spending entire Sunday afternoons moving through the swamp, arriving back at the plantation exhausted and covered in mud, but carrying increasingly precise knowledge. When Marcus was 19, Kendrick died of a heart attack and his estate was liquidated. Marcus was sold again, this time at an estate auction in Savannah to Thomas Grayson, who paid $800 for him. A premium price that reflected Marcus's reputation as a strong, skilled worker who never caused trouble. The Grayson Plantation, 30 miles south of Savannah, would become the stage for Marcus's most sophisticated work. The property was enormous. 4,000 acres of prime cotton land worked by 120 enslaved people. It was bordered on the east by the Ogeechee River, a significant waterway that connected to the coast, and on the west by a cypress swamp, similar to the one Marcus had been studying for years. The northern and southern boundaries were marked by smaller creeks and patches of pine forest. To anyone else, these geographical features were simply the natural borders of the estate. To Marcus, they were a network of potential escape routes waiting to be connected. Thomas Grayson was a second-generation plantation owner, 42 years old when Marcus arrived, educated at a northern university, but thoroughly committed to the plantation system that had made his family wealthy. He was not particularly cruel by the standards of his time and place. He believed in maintaining discipline through economic incentives as much as punishment, allowed his enslaved workers slightly better food and housing than some neighbors, and rarely separated families through sale. But he was also a shrewd businessman who watched his property carefully and didn't tolerate challenges to his authority. The plantation's overseer, a man named Howell, was a different story. He'd worked Georgia plantations for 20 years and had developed the casual brutality of someone who saw enslaved people as livestock to be managed rather than humans to be governed. Howell carried a whip and used it frequently, enforced a rigid system of passes and permissions that restricted movement, and maintained a network of informants among the enslaved population who traded small betrayals for minor privileges. Marcus spent his first 6 months at the Grayson plantation, keeping his head down and observing. He worked hard in the fields, volunteered for difficult assignments, and earned a reputation as reliable. He spoke little and revealed nothing, but he was memorizing everything: the patrol routes that white overseers followed, the blind spots in the plantation's surveillance, the personalities and vulnerabilities of every person who held power, and most importantly, the land itself. The Ogeechee River was tidal in this region, its lower reaches affected by Atlantic tides that pushed salt water inland twice a day. Marcus spent his Sunday rest periods walking the riverbank, noting how the water level changed throughout the day and month. He identified several potential crossing points, each with different characteristics. There was a wide, shallow section where the river spread out over a gravel bed during low tide, making it easily wadable. There was a narrow section with a strong current but stable banks where a decent swimmer could cross even at high tide. And there was a point where a fallen tree created a natural bridge during certain water conditions. The western swamp was extensive, easily 2 miles deep, and local white men avoided it completely. Marcus began exploring it systematically, dedicating every free moment to understanding its geography. He moved carefully, testing each step, learning which areas were solid and which would swallow him. He made note of landmarks: a lightning-struck cypress with a distinctive split trunk, a cluster of palmetto plants that indicated slightly higher ground, a spring that created a clear water pool in the midst of dark swamp water. After a year, Marcus had mentally mapped not just the Grayson plantation but a 50-mile radius around it. He knew every plantation in the region, having been sent on errands that gave him opportunities to observe neighboring properties. He knew the locations of small settlements of free black people who might offer help to runaways. He knew which roads were regularly patrolled and which were ignored. He knew where the Quaker communities lived, religious groups opposed to slavery who sometimes helped fugitives despite the legal risks. And slowly, carefully, Marcus began to share this knowledge. The first person he helped was a man named Benjamin, who worked in the Grayson Plantation's carpentry shop. Benjamin was 40 years old, skilled enough to be valuable, but constantly threatened with sale to pay Grayson's gambling debts. He approached Marcus one evening in late summer of 1838, after watching him for months and concluding that the quiet field worker knew things others didn't. "I need to ask you something," Benjamin said carefully, making sure they were far from any possible listeners. "And if I'm wrong to ask, just say so, and we never speak of it again." Marcus waited. "They say you know the swamp, that you spend your Sundays out there, is that true?" "I check traps," Marcus said non-committally. "Hunt a little. I think you do more than that. I think you're learning it like a man who might need to use it someday." Marcus studied Benjamin's face, the desperation there, the intelligence, the fear. "Why are you asking?" "Because Grayson's selling me next month to a buyer from Alabama. I'll never see my wife again, never see my children, and I'd rather die trying to get north than accept that." It was the moment Marcus had been half expecting and half dreading. Helping someone escape was a capital offense. If caught, he could be hanged or beaten to death. But refusing meant becoming complicit in the system he hated. He made his decision in the space of 3 heartbeats. "There's a way through the swamp," Marcus said quietly. "But you have to follow my instructions exactly. Any deviation and you'll die out there, and that helps nobody." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus taught Benjamin the route. Not by taking him into the swamp, that would be too risky, but by describing landmarks in meticulous detail. "You enter at the point where the big oak tree has fallen across the water. You can't miss it. The tree's been dead for years, no leaves, bark falling off. You step onto that trunk and walk across it. It'll hold your weight. On the far side, you'll see 3 cypress trees in a straight line. Walk toward them, keeping them aligned. The ground there is solid, just 2 inches under the water. Your feet will tell you when you step off it." The description continued for hours across multiple conversations. Marcus was teaching Benjamin to see the swamp through his eyes, to recognize the subtle markers that indicated safe passage. He also taught him the timing, when to move, when to wait, how to use weather and darkness as cover. Benjamin escaped on a moonless night in September. He was discovered missing at the morning bell, and Howell immediately organized a search party. They went straight for the swamp with dogs, confident they'd either find Benjamin's body or track him down within hours. They found nothing. The dogs reached the swamp's edge and went frantic, running in circles, unable to pick up a scent. Howell and his men spent 12 hours searching the areas they could safely access, but Benjamin had simply vanished. After 3 days, they gave up. Grayson chalked it up to another loss, expensive and frustrating but not unprecedented. Enslaved people did sometimes successfully escape despite the odds. What no one except Marcus knew was that Benjamin had followed the route exactly as described, made it through the swamp in 6 hours, and emerged on the far side where a free black family Marcus had made contact with was waiting with dry clothes, food, and directions to the next safe house. Benjamin would eventually reach Pennsylvania, though Marcus never learned his ultimate fate. The success of escape couldn't be confirmed, only hoped for. But the word spread quietly through the slave quarters. Marcus knew the routes. Over the next 3 years, Marcus helped 4 more people escape from the Grayson Plantation. Each escape was carefully spaced, 6 months to a year apart, to avoid establishing an obvious pattern. Each person was someone Marcus had observed and vetted carefully, looking for intelligence, physical capability, and desperate motivation. He turned away more people than he helped, knowing that not everyone could survive the journey and that failures would bring increased scrutiny. The escapes were sophisticated, each using different techniques. One man went through the swamp. One woman crossed the river during a spring tide and followed the coast north. One young man used the pine forests, moving through a series of connected woodland patches that avoided all major roads. Each route was customized to the individual's strengths and the specific conditions at the time of escape. and each success built Marcus's reputation among the enslaved population of central Georgia. His name started appearing in whispered conversations on plantations he'd never visited. People who were planning to run would try to get messages to him through intermediaries, asking for guidance. A network was forming, invisible to white observers but increasingly real to those who needed it. In 1841, a young woman named Charity arrived at the Grayson Plantation, sold from a failing South Carolina estate. She was 17, unusually educated because her former mistress had taught her to read, and determined not to spend her life picking cotton. Within 2 weeks of arrival, she'd identified Marcus as the person who might help her. Charity was different from the others Marcus had helped. She was bolder, more willing to take risks, and she wanted not just to escape herself, but to learn the system so she could help others. "Teach me," she said during their third conversation. "Don't just give me a route, teach me how you know what you know." Marcus was hesitant. Every person who understood the routes increased the risk of exposure. But Charity was persistent and clearly capable. Over 6 weeks, he taught her what he'd learned over years: how to read landscapes for navigability, how to identify safe water sources, how to move through wilderness without leaving obvious traces, how to read weather patterns and use them for cover, how to identify which white people might help and which would turn you in without hesitation. Charity escaped in October, using the swamp route during a period of heavy rain that made tracking impossible. The search party found nothing as usual, but Charity didn't just disappear north. She stopped at a settlement of free black people Marcus had told her about, spent 2 weeks learning the next section of route, then moved on. She was building her own mental map, extending the network Marcus had started. 3 months later, Marcus received word through an intermediary that Charity had made it to Pennsylvania and was working with an organization that helped escaped slaves establish new lives. She sent back a coded message. The route worked, and she'd successfully guided 2 other people through it using the knowledge Marcus had taught her. That was the moment Marcus understood the true potential of what he was building. If he could teach others, the network could grow beyond his individual reach. The knowledge could spread, becoming something bigger than one man's skills. He began deliberately seeking out people who showed aptitude, teaching them sections of routes, building a distributed system of guides who could operate independently. By 1843, the network extended across 7 counties in central Georgia. There were at least 15 people who knew portions of the routes and could guide others. The escapes accelerated, not dramatically enough to trigger panic, but enough that plantation owners started noticing an uptick in successful runaways who seemed unnaturally skilled at avoiding capture. The plantation owners held a meeting in Savannah in the summer of 1843, comparing notes on losses and looking for patterns. 8 estates reported a combined total of 23 successful escapes over the previous 2 years, nearly triple the historical rate. More troubling, the quality of the escapes was improving. People were crossing rivers at impossible points, navigating swamps that should have killed them, avoiding patrols with suspiciously good timing. "Someone's teaching them," one plantation owner said flatly. "This isn't luck. This is knowledge." They hired additional patrols, increased the frequency of plantation inspections, and offered substantial rewards for information about escape networks. The pressure increased. Marcus had to become more careful, spacing out escapes even more, spending months between active operations to let suspicion cool. It was during this period of increased scrutiny that Charity returned. She appeared one night at the edge of the Grayson Plantation, moving through the darkness like she'd been born to it. Marcus almost didn't recognize her. She'd cut her hair short, was dressed in men's clothing, and carried herself with a confidence she hadn't possessed 2 years earlier. She'd come back south deliberately, risking recapture, because she had something to tell him. "The network in Pennsylvania is strong," she said. "There are people there, white and black, who are organized, who have money and resources. They want to know if we can create a more structured route, not just random escapes, but a real pipeline that can move larger numbers of people." Marcus listened as Charity described what would later be called the Underground Railroad, a coordinated system of safe houses, guides, and transportation that stretched from the Deep South to Canada. It was ambitious, dangerous, and possible if enough people were willing to risk everything. "I can't promise larger numbers," Marcus said carefully. "Every additional escape increases the risk of discovery, but I can promise more consistency. If people can reach me, I can get them through Georgia. What happens beyond that is up to your northern connections." They spent 3 days together, Charity hiding in a carefully concealed spot in the swamp while Marcus brought her food and information. They coordinated routes, established communication methods, and discussed security protocols. When Charity left to return north, Marcus had a clearer sense of how his local network fit into a broader system of resistance. The collaboration with northern abolitionists changed everything. Messages started arriving through circuitous routes, encoded letters delivered by free black sailors, verbal communications passed along by itinerant preachers, coded advertisements placed in newspapers that Marcus could access occasionally when he was sent to town on errands. The messages contained information: which routes in other states were being watched, which safe houses had been compromised, what time of year offered the best conditions for travel. Marcus integrated this intelligence into his planning. Escapes became more sophisticated, time to coordinate with available assistance in other states. People weren't just fleeing into an unknown wilderness anymore, they were being guided along a specific path with known endpoints. But success bred attention. By 1845, Thomas Grayson had become suspicious, not of Marcus specifically, but of the pattern. Too many slaves were successfully escaping from his plantation and neighboring properties. Someone had to be helping them. Grayson started paying closer attention to the movements of his enslaved population, noting who spoke to whom, who seemed to move around more than necessary. He noticed Marcus. Nothing specific, nothing he could act on, but Marcus was always there in the background of incidents. A slave would disappear, and upon investigation, someone would mention having seen them talking with Marcus the week before. It happened once, twice, 3 times. Grayson started keeping a personal record, noting coincidences. Marcus sensed the increased scrutiny and pulled back. For 8 months in 1845 and early 1846, he helped no one escape from the Grayson plantation. He focused entirely on being an exemplary worker, productive, obedient, invisible. The strategy worked. Without new incidents, Grayson's suspicion cooled. Maybe the coincidences had been just that, coincidences. But Marcus didn't stop helping people from other plantations. He'd built a network that could operate without his direct involvement. Guides he'd trained continued moving people through the routes. The system had become self-sustaining. In the spring of 1846, a major incident occurred that would thrust Marcus into direct confrontation with the plantation system's enforcement apparatus. A family of 6, parents and 4 children, escaped from a plantation 20 miles north of the Grayson estate. The escape was spectacular in its precision. They disappeared on a night with perfect weather conditions, left almost no trail, and seemed to have vanished into thin air. The plantation owner, a wealthy man named Terence who had political connections across Georgia, was furious. He didn't just want the family back. He wanted to break the network that had helped them. Terence hired professional slave catchers from Virginia, a group led by a man named Cyrus Hatch, who had a reputation for never losing a trail. Hatch arrived in Georgia with 5 assistants, 23 trained tracking dogs, and a systematic approach to investigation that went beyond simple pursuit. He interviewed enslaved populations, analyzed previous escape patterns, studied maps and terrain, and slowly assembled a profile of what he was dealing with. "This isn't random," Hatch told Terence after a week of investigation. "Someone knows this terrain intimately. Someone's been teaching escape routes, probably for years, and that someone is likely still here on one of these plantations." Hatch began a methodical campaign to identify the guide. He visited every plantation within 30 miles, requesting access to enslaved populations for interviews. Most plantation owners cooperated, curious to see if the famous slave catcher could solve the mystery. When Hatch reached the Grayson plantation, he spent 2 days interviewing workers and observing movements. He identified Marcus within an hour. Not because Marcus did anything suspicious, precisely the opposite. Marcus was too perfect, too calm, too observant while pretending not to observe. Hatch had spent years reading people, and he recognized intelligence being deliberately concealed. During his interview with Marcus, Hatch asked seemingly casual questions about the local geography, and Marcus answered with carefully calibrated ignorance, knowing just enough to seem like a field worker who paid casual attention to his surroundings, but not enough to reveal depth of knowledge, except Hatch caught him in a small slip. When asked about the western swamp, Marcus described it as impassable, too dangerous to enter, but his eyes had flickered briefly toward the northwest, a micro-expression that suggested he knew the specific direction of safe passage. It was a split-second tell, easily missed. Hatch didn't miss it. Hatch didn't. After leaving the Grayson plantation, Hatch reported his findings to Terrence and suggested a strategy. "We can't prove anything yet, but I believe there's a man on the Grayson estate who knows the routes. Here's what we do. We let him think we've moved on to other investigations. Meanwhile, we set up surveillance. Sooner or later, he'll make contact with someone planning to run, and when he does, we'll have proof." The trap was set. Marcus knew he'd been made. He couldn't identify exactly what had given him away, but Hatch's interview had felt different from the others, more probing, more intelligent. Marcus assumed he was now under observation and acted accordingly. He stopped all direct involvement in escapes, avoided suspicious conversations, and became even more exemplary in his work behavior. But the network had grown beyond his control. Other guides were still operating, people were still running, and the system continued functioning. In August of 1846, a young man named Jacob escaped from Terrence's plantation, using a route through the pine forests that Marcus had pioneered, but now was managed by other guides. The escape was clean, professional, and infuriating to Terrence and Hatch. Hatch realized his surveillance strategy wasn't working. If Marcus was the key, he'd gone completely dormant. Hatch needed a different approach. He needed to force Marcus into the open. After consulting with Terrence and several other plantation owners, Hatch proposed something radical: make Marcus an offer he couldn't refuse. That's when Thomas Grayson called Marcus to the main house in January of 1847 and made the proposal that would define the next phase of Marcus's life. "Sit down," Grayson said, a command that was already unusual. Enslaved people didn't sit in the presence of owners. Marcus lowered himself carefully onto a wooden chair, every muscle tense. "Cyrus Hatch believes you're the person who's been helping slaves escape," Grayson said bluntly. "He can't prove it, but he's convinced, and after reviewing the patterns myself, I'm inclined to agree." Marcus kept his face neutral, said nothing. "Here's your situation," Grayson continued. "I can have you whipped, sold, or worse based on nothing but suspicion. I'm powerful enough that I don't need proof. Or," he paused, "you can work for me. Officially, I'll make you a driver, give you authority and privileges. In exchange, you use your knowledge to help me track down runaways. You'll be paid for successful recoveries. You'll live better than you've ever lived." The offer was poisonous, brilliant, and impossible to refuse without confirming guilt. Marcus understood he was being maneuvered into a position where any choice would destroy him. If he refused, he'd be punished and lose the ability to help anyone. If he accepted and actually helped recapture people, he'd betray everything he'd built. But if he accepted and sabotaged the operation, "I accept," Marcus said quietly. Over the following days, Marcus thought through his new strategy. He would pretend to hunt runaways while actually protecting the network. It required incredible precision. He had to appear competent enough to justify his position, but ineffective enough that people still escaped. He had to betray some people to protect others, making horrible calculations about who could be sacrificed to maintain cover. The first hunt came within a week. 2 enslaved people ran from a plantation 15 miles south. A husband and wife, who'd fled in desperation after learning they'd be separated through sale. Grayson sent Marcus with a search party led by Howell. Marcus knew immediately these weren't people who'd been guided. They'd run in panic, making basic mistakes, traveling on a clear night when they could be easily spotted, following obvious routes toward the river, leaving clear signs of passage. Marcus recognized the pattern of untrained escapees and made a decision. He would find them, because failing to do so would destroy his credibility immediately. He tracked them to a creek bed 7 miles from the plantation, where they'd collapsed from exhaustion. When the search party caught up, Marcus was standing over the couple, his expression carefully neutral. Howell grinned with satisfaction. "Told you he was worth it," he said to the other men. The couple was returned, punished severely, and sold separately within a month. Marcus felt the weight of their suffering like physical pain, but he understood the brutal calculus, sacrificing 2 to potentially save hundreds. It didn't make it easier. Over the next 6 months, Marcus participated in 14 hunts. He successfully tracked and recaptured 5 runaways, all people who'd run without network assistance and would likely have been caught anyway. The other 9 were people Marcus had helped or who'd been guided by his trained network, and those escapes he carefully sabotaged. He'd lead search parties in plausible but ultimately wrong directions, always having reasonable explanations for why the trail went cold. He'd misread signs, mistake the timing of river crossings, guide parties into difficult terrain that slowed pursuit while allowing fugitives to gain distance. The strategy was working, but it was costing him. Every person he recaptured haunted him. Every hunt required him to display skills he'd developed to free people while using them to enslave. The moral weight was crushing. And then came Sarah. Sarah was a woman in her early 40s who lived on the Grayson Plantation. She had 3 half-grown children and had been enslaved her entire life on the property. She was known for being quiet, competent, and utterly devoted to her children. Marcus had spoken with her several times over the years, but she'd never expressed interest in escape. She wouldn't leave without her children, and escaping with children was exponentially more dangerous. In September of 1847, everything changed. Grayson, facing financial pressure from failed investments, decided to sell Sarah's oldest son, a boy of 14, to recoup losses. Sarah learned about the sale 3 days before it was scheduled to occur. She approached Marcus in the fields during a brief moment when they were working near each other, and no overseer was within earshot. "I need help," she said simply. "They're taking my boy. I can't let that happen." Marcus felt his stomach sink. "If you run with children, especially 3 of them, the chances—" "I know the chances," Sarah interrupted. "I'm asking anyway." Marcus looked at her face. The desperation there, the determination, the willingness to die trying rather than accept her son's sale. He nodded slowly. "2 nights from now, I'll show you the way." But Marcus had been under Grayson's employment as a tracker for over 6 months now, and Grayson was watching him carefully. That evening, Grayson called Marcus to the main house. "I'm aware that Sarah is upset about her son's sale," Grayson said. "I'm also aware she might try something foolish. You're going to watch her, and if she runs, you're going to lead the party that brings her back. This is your test, Marcus. Succeed, and you prove your loyalty. Fail, and I'll know where your sympathies really lie." Marcus was trapped. Grayson had somehow learned about Sarah's desperation and was using it to force a definitive proof of Marcus's allegiance. If Marcus helped Sarah escape, he'd be exposed and likely executed. If he helped recapture her, he'd betray someone who'd trusted him and destroy his own conscience. He had 48 hours to solve an unsolvable problem. Marcus went back to the quarters that night and found Sarah. They spoke in whispers outside her cabin, where her children slept. "Grayson knows you're thinking about running," Marcus said. "He set me up to either help catch you or expose myself." Sarah's face crumpled. "So there's no way out." "There's one way," Marcus said slowly, the plan forming even as he spoke. "But it costs me everything, and it might not even work." He explained his idea. Sarah would attempt an escape in 2 nights, but deliberately make it obvious and amateurish. Marcus would track her with a search party, but he'd lead them into the most dangerous section of swamp he knew, an area where a recent storm had created unstable, treacherous conditions. The search party would get into serious trouble, forcing a rescue operation and creating enough chaos that Sarah's recapture would seem secondary. In the confusion, Marcus would lose his position as a tracker, probably face punishment, but Sarah might be able to use the distraction to attempt a real escape later with help from other network members. It was a terrible plan with low odds of success. But it was the only plan that gave Sarah any chance at all while protecting the broader network. Sarah agreed. 2 nights later, Sarah made her escape attempt. She was deliberately noisy, waking other enslaved people who would report hearing disturbances. She left obvious tracks through the quarters and toward the western swamp. When the alarm was raised at dawn, Grayson personally assembled the search party and put Marcus in command. "Bring her back," Grayson said, "and bring me proof that you're who you claim to be." Hatch was present for the hunt, observing carefully. The party consisted of Marcus, Howell, Hatch, and 5 other men, along with tracking dogs. They followed Sarah's trail easily. She'd made sure of that. The tracks led directly into the swamp, toward the area Marcus had identified as currently dangerous. "She went into the suicide swamp," Howell said with satisfaction. "Stupid woman, she'll be dead by noon." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but Grayson wants her back. We go in." He led the party into the swamp, following what appeared to be Sarah's path. The water was higher than usual from recent rains, and the ground was dangerously unstable. Marcus guided them deeper, always seeming to follow legitimate signs of passage, always having plausible reasons for the route he chose. An hour in, they reached the trap. It was an area where the storm had created hidden sinkholes, pockets of liquefied mud concealed beneath shallow water. Marcus stepped carefully around one, making it look accidental. Howell, following behind, stepped directly into it. He sank instantly to mid-thigh, the mud gripping like a living thing. His shout of alarm startled the man behind him, who stepped wrong and also started sinking. Within 30 seconds, 3 men were trapped in mud, thrashing and sinking deeper with every movement. The dogs went wild, barking frantically. The men who weren't trapped started trying to help, which destabilized the ground further. Hatch stood back, watching the chaos, and his eyes never left Marcus. He saw what was happening. This wasn't accident. It was orchestrated. Marcus had led them here deliberately. "You did this," Hatch said quietly, his voice barely audible over the panicked shouting. Marcus looked at him. "The swamp did this. I just forgot to mention this section floods badly after storms." "You forgot nothing," Hatch said, "and now I know exactly what you are." The extraction took 4 hours. They had to cut vines and branches to create makeshift rafts, distributing weight to avoid further sinkholes. One man suffered a deep gash on his leg from a submerged branch, and the wound immediately showed signs of infection from the filthy water. By the time they limped back to the plantation, exhausted and humiliated, Sarah's trail was cold, and the search had to be abandoned. They found her 3 days later, less than 8 miles away, hiding in a hollow tree and half-starved. She was recaptured, punished with 30 lashes, and confined. Marcus's plan had failed. Sarah hadn't escaped, and he'd exposed himself in the process. Grayson's fury was spectacular. He stripped Marcus of his tracker position immediately, sending him back to fieldwork under maximum supervision. He didn't have Marcus killed or sold, calculating that a live, humiliated Marcus was better as an example than a dead martyr. But the message was clear. Marcus's special status was over. Hatch left Georgia a week later, reporting to the plantation owners who'd hired him that he'd identified the network's key architect, but that destroying the network entirely would require resources beyond what they were willing to pay. The system was too distributed now, too deeply embedded. Marcus was the architect, but the building no longer required him to stand. For Marcus, the aftermath of the Sarah incident was devastating. He'd lost his mobility, his ability to operate, and any remaining cover. Sarah suffered for trusting him, and the network continued without him, which meant he'd become expendable to the very system he'd created. But something unexpected happened. The network, now operating primarily through the guides Marcus had trained, accelerated. Freed from the need to protect Marcus's cover, other operatives took more risks. Escapes increased. The routes Marcus had pioneered were used by dozens, then hundreds of people over the following years. The knowledge spread across Georgia and into neighboring states. Marcus spent the next year doing hard labor in the fields, watched constantly, forbidden from leaving plantation grounds. It was the lowest point of his life. He was back where he'd started, with no apparent path forward and carrying the weight of those he felt he'd failed. Then, in November of 1848, something shifted. Thomas Grayson contracted a severe fever. It lasted 3 weeks, during which plantation management fell into chaos as overseers jockeyed for position and authority. During that period of disrupted oversight, Marcus received a message smuggled in by a sympathetic, free black person who occasionally delivered supplies to the plantation. The message was from Charity. She'd built an organization in Pennsylvania that was now coordinating with abolitionists across multiple states. The network Marcus had started in Georgia was part of a much larger system extending from the Deep South to Canada. Hundreds of people had successfully reached freedom using routes Marcus had pioneered or techniques he'd developed. And Charity wanted him to know his work had mattered. It was still mattering. The message gave Marcus something he'd lost: purpose. Even confined to the plantation, even without freedom of movement, he could still teach. He started giving quiet lessons to younger enslaved workers, not about escape routes specifically, but about observation, about reading landscapes, about remembering what you learn. He was planting seeds that might not grow for years, but would eventually extend the knowledge even further. Thomas Grayson survived his illness, but he was changed. The fever had weakened him physically, and he began making preparations to transition some of his estate responsibilities to his son, James, who was living in Charleston and managing shipping interests. James visited the plantation in early 1849 and brought different ideas about labor management. He'd been exposed to northern business practices and thought the plantation system was economically inefficient and politically unsustainable. He didn't care about slavery on moral grounds. His concerns were purely pragmatic, but his calculations led him toward considering alternatives. Marcus watched these developments with careful attention. Change was coming, though he couldn't yet see what form it would take. He continued his patient work of teaching, observing, and waiting for opportunity. In March of 1850, another unexpected event occurred. A young enslaved man on a neighboring plantation successfully escaped using routes from Marcus's network and made it to Pennsylvania. Once there, he gave detailed information to abolitionist organizations about how the Georgia routes worked, who had created them, and who was still trapped in slavery despite having built the system. The abolitionists began discussing whether it might be possible to purchase Marcus's freedom. Buying enslaved people specifically to free them was controversial even within abolitionist circles, as it seemed to validate the concept of human ownership. But some organizations were willing to consider it for people who'd contributed significantly to the Underground Railroad. The negotiations were complex and had to be conducted secretly through intermediaries. Northern abolitionists couldn't directly contact Southern plantation owners without raising immediate suspicion. They used free black merchants and sympathetic Southern Quakers as go-betweens, creating a chain of communication so convoluted that it took over a year to establish contact. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his work. In late 1850, he successfully taught escape techniques to a woman named Rachel, who used them to flee with her 2 children. In early 1851, he provided critical information about patrol routes that helped 3 men from a neighboring plantation escape successfully. He was operating more carefully than ever, using layers of intermediaries and communication methods so subtle they were nearly invisible. Thomas Grayson died suddenly in November of 1851 from a second fever, this one more severe. His death thrust James Grayson into full control of the estate. James had been reviewing the plantation's finances and was deeply troubled by what he found. Consistent losses, failed investments, and a labor system that he believed was fundamentally unprofitable compared to emerging industrial alternatives. He began a gradual process of liquidating the estate, selling land parcels and releasing enslaved workers through various mechanisms. In January of 1852, James Grayson called Marcus to the main house. Marcus entered expecting punishment or sale. Those were the usual outcomes of such summons. Instead, James handed him a piece of paper. It was a manumission document. Marcus was being freed. "This isn't charity," James said flatly. "This is economics. I'm transitioning away from slave labor, and releasing workers piecemeal is cheaper than maintaining them. You're strong enough to find employment elsewhere, which means you won't become my problem. Take the document and leave." Marcus stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. After 33 years of enslavement, freedom was being handed to him as a casualty of economic calculation. It wasn't the dramatic liberation he might have imagined, but it was real. He walked out of the Grayson main house a free man. Marcus didn't leave Georgia immediately. Instead, he traveled to the coastal town of Darien, where he'd spent years as a youth learning the Tidewater region. He found work as a boat pilot, using his intimate knowledge of coastal waterways to guide ships through Georgia's complex network of channels and barrier islands. It was legal work that paid actual wages and allowed him freedom of movement. But he never stopped helping people escape. Now, operating as a free man, Marcus had resources and mobility he'd never possessed before. He could travel between towns without passes, could coordinate openly with free black communities, could establish relationships with ship captains willing to transport fugitives north along the coast. The network he'd built during enslavement expanded dramatically during his freedom. Between 1852 and 1861, Marcus helped an estimated 120 people escape slavery. The exact number is unknowable. Successful escapes weren't documented by design, but that's the conservative estimate, based on fragmentary records and testimony preserved by abolitionist organizations. When the Civil War began in 1861, Marcus was 42 years old. When Union forces began operations in Georgia in 1863, they sought out people with intimate knowledge of the state's geography. Marcus volunteered immediately, serving as a civilian guide for Union Army units operating in coastal Georgia, and eventually for General Sherman's 1864 March to the Sea. The routes Marcus had pioneered for freeing enslaved individuals became military assets. The swamp crossings that had mystified slave catchers mystified Confederate patrols. The hidden waterways that had carried fugitives carried Union scouts. The network of sympathetic communities that had sheltered escapees provided intelligence to Union forces. Everything Marcus had built became a weapon against the system that had tried to crush him. After the war, Marcus settled permanently in Darien. He married Hannah, a woman who'd escaped slavery in Virginia using routes similar to those he'd created. They had 4 children and lived in a modest house near the Altamaha River. Marcus worked as a surveyor and land agent, using his geographic knowledge to help newly freed black people establish property claims and navigate the complicated post-war landscape of Georgia land ownership. He rarely spoke publicly about his pre-war activities. The South during Reconstruction was a dangerous place for people who'd helped destroy slavery, and discretion remained survival strategy. But he taught his children everything he knew about reading landscapes, about finding routes where none seemed to exist, about the difference between maps drawn in offices and maps written into the land itself. In 1877, a researcher from a northern university came to Darien interviewing former enslaved people about their experiences. Marcus was 58 years old then, his body showing the wear of decades of hard labor, but his mind still sharp. He agreed to be interviewed, and over 3 days he described the routes, the techniques, the calculations and risks of running a clandestine network through one of slavery's heartlands. "How did you remember it all?" the researcher asked at one point. All those roots, all those details, all those people. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. I didn't remember it separate from myself, he said finally. The roots were part of me. Every swamp crossing, every river ford, every section of solid ground hidden under water. I walked them so many times they became as familiar as my own hands. And every person I helped gave those roots meaning. You don't forget something that's written into your body and your purpose. The researcher took extensive notes, and those documents survived in university archives. They were rediscovered in the 1930s by historians beginning to systematically document underground railroad operations. Marcus's testimony provided some of the most detailed descriptions of Southern escape networks that had been preserved, helping later generations understand the sophistication and courage required to operate such systems in hostile territory. Marcus died in 1888 at the age of 69. His funeral in Darien was attended by over 200 people, many of them freed people and their descendants who'd benefited directly or indirectly from the roots he'd created. The pastor delivering the eulogy said something that was recorded in the church's records. Brother Marcus taught us that freedom isn't just about walking away. It's about knowing where you're walking to and having the knowledge to get there. He gave us maps that weren't drawn on paper, but written into the land itself. Those maps still exist for those who know how to read them. The specific routes Marcus pioneered are mostly forgotten now, overgrown or altered by centuries of development. The swamps he navigated have been partially drained. The plantations where he lived and worked have been subdivided or abandoned. The physical landscape has changed, but the principle he demonstrated remains. Knowledge is power, especially knowledge that those in authority don't possess. Marcus proved that an enslaved person with no formal education, no legal rights, and no resources beyond his own intelligence and observation could build something that challenged one of history's most oppressive systems. He proved that maps aren't neutral documents but political tools, and that alternate maps, drawn from different perspectives, containing different information, can enable resistance that seems impossible. Historians estimate that the routes Marcus created and the techniques he pioneered contributed to somewhere between 300 and 600 successful escapes from Georgia and surrounding states between 1838 and 1865. The uncertainty in numbers is appropriate. Successful resistance leaves fewer records than failed attempts, and much of what Marcus built was deliberately designed to be invisible. What's certain is that plantation owners across central Georgia lived in fear of a man whose greatest weapon was understanding the land beneath their feet better than they ever could. They called him the ghost of the swamps because he could appear and disappear, because he could guide others through terrain they considered impassable, because he challenged their claim to absolute control. But Marcus never thought of himself as a ghost. He was simply a man who paid attention, who remembered what he learned, who understood that observation and intelligence could be as powerful as any physical force, and who proved, across 3 decades of patient, dangerous work, that no prison is truly escape-proof if you understand its geography better than the people who built it. The land is still there, Georgia's swamps and rivers, forests and coastal marshes. They look different now, marked by roads and bridges and development that didn't exist in Marcus's time. But the fundamental geography remains. The rivers still flow along the same channels. The swamps still flood and recede with predictable patterns. The barrier islands still shift with tides and storms. And somewhere in those landscapes, invisible to anyone who doesn't know the history, are the routes that Marcus walked. Not marked, not memorialized, but real nonetheless. Routes that once meant the difference between bondage and freedom, between despair and hope, between accepting the world as it was claimed to be and discovering the world as it actually existed for those brave enough to see it differently. Marcus's great-grandson, interviewed in 1947 when he was 70 years old, was asked what he knew about his ancestor. He said simply, "My great-grandfather understood something most folks never learn. The land doesn't belong to whoever has the deed, it belongs to whoever knows it, and he knew it better than anyone."